The morning air in December 1944 felt like a knife. The Ardennes forest, blanketed in snow, was silent except for the crunch of boots and the low growl of distant engines. German prisoners of war, captured during the opening clashes of the Battle of the Bulge, shuffled nervously down a muddy road toward an American transport truck. Their uniforms were torn, their breath hung in the icy air, and their eyes darted at the armed GIs escorting them. For many of these German soldiers, being captured by the Americans was both terrifying and strangely relieving. The propaganda fed to them by the Nazi regime had painted the Americans as brutal, undisciplined savages who would shoot prisoners on sight. Yet, so far, the guards looked organized, calm, even human. But one thought gave them comfort. At least here, they could speak freely in German without being understood. Inside their minds, whispers formed. "We mustn't talk too openly," one muttered. "But perhaps we can discuss escape later, in camp. They won't know." A young Panzer Grenadier smirked. "These Americans? They can barely pronounce our names. We'll outsmart them." The others nodded, reassured. But then it happened. As the group approached a checkpoint, one of the prisoners cursed under his breath in German, mocking the slowness of the guards. Without hesitation, the tall American sergeant standing nearby turned his head and barked back, in flawless, sharp German. "Halt die Klapp, oder du wirst es bereuen." "Shut your mouth, or you'll regret it." The prisoners froze. Their faces drained of color. How could this be? An American, speaking perfect German? Not broken phrases. Not a few memorized words. But the kind of German only a native, or someone raised among Germans, could speak. The sergeant smirked slightly, then continued issuing orders to his men in English, as if nothing had happened. The German POWs looked at one another in disbelief. If the guards understood everything they said, then no secret was safe. No whispered plan, no coded insult, no private thought. That moment was more than humiliation, it was psychological warfare. The prisoners suddenly realized they weren't just fighting against tanks, planes, and artillery. They were up against an enemy who had grown up in their very culture, spoke their mother tongue, and could see straight into their minds. For German POWs, America was no longer just a foreign land. It was a mirror, reflecting back their own language, their own heritage, now wielded against them. The transport trucks rumbled across the snow-covered countryside, their engines echoing like thunder through the frozen stillness. Inside, German POWs sat in silence, their minds racing after the shock of hearing American guards speak fluent German. Every bump in the road jolted their bodies, but it was their thoughts that shook harder. The young Panzer Grenadier who had mocked the guards earlier now kept his mouth shut, staring at his boots. The older sergeant beside him whispered, "If they understand us, we must be careful." Every word could be overheard. But even whispering felt dangerous now. Their confidence, the belief that language was their shield, had been shattered. Hours passed before the convoy finally reached a sprawling camp enclosed by barbed wire and watchtowers. From a distance, the camp looked like something out of German propaganda films. Rows of wooden barracks, guard towers with searchlights, the perimeter patrolled by armed men. The prisoners braced themselves for brutality. But what they encountered next defied every expectation. The gates creaked open, and as the prisoners filed in, American guards shouted orders, sometimes in English, sometimes, shockingly, in crisp German. "Schneller! In Reihen aufstellen! Faster! Line up in rows!" The command cut through the cold air with the authority of a Wehrmacht officer. The POWs obeyed instantly, not because of fear of bullets, but because the voice spoke with the authority of home. Inside the barracks, the shock continued. On the walls hung posters, not just in English, but in German. Rules, camp schedules, even notices about meals were translated with perfect grammar. It was as if the Americans had built a prison that spoke their language back to them. That night, in the dim light of a single bulb, whispers spread among the captured soldiers. "Do you think all the guards speak German?" one asked nervously. "No," another replied. "It can't be. Maybe just a few." But as the days passed, the truth became undeniable. Everywhere they turned, whether at the mess hall, during roll call, or even casual exchanges in the yard, there were Americans who not only understood German but spoke it with frightening fluency. What the POWs didn't know was that many of these guards weren't just Americans. They were sons of German immigrants, first and second generation families who had carried their language across the Atlantic. Some had grown up in households where only German was spoken. Others had been teachers, students, or even refugees before the war. Now, they used that same language as a weapon. For the Germans, this realization carried a heavy weight. In their homeland, they had believed themselves to be culturally and linguistically superior. German was the language of philosophy, science, and precision. Yet here, across the ocean, in the very land they had been taught to despise, their language had been mastered, absorbed, and now turned against them. Every mealtime, every inspection, every casual insult whispered under their breath. Nothing was private anymore. Even conversations about escape routes, coded phrases, or attempts to test the guards were overheard and answered back. Sometimes with warnings, sometimes with smirks, and sometimes with eerie silence that meant only one thing: they understood, and they were watching. The humiliation cut deep. To be defeated on the battlefield was one thing, but to be stripped of even the sanctuary of their own language, this was a slow, psychological defeat that gnawed at them day by day. And yet, what unsettled them most wasn't just the guards. It was the knowledge that America itself seemed to understand them, more than they had ever imagined. The POWs had barely settled into the uneasy rhythm of camp life when the real test began. Word spread quickly among the prisoners. "They are calling men in for questioning." At first, no one worried. German soldiers were used to interrogations. They had been trained to give only name, rank, and serial number. Nothing more. That was the code of honor drilled into them by the Wehrmacht. But the first prisoners to return from interrogation looked pale, shaken. Their fellow soldiers crowded around, whispering, "What did they ask you? Did you give them anything?" The men simply shook their heads, refusing to speak. Their silence was louder than words. Finally, it was the young Panzer Grenadier's turn. 2 guards led him into a plain wooden hut at the edge of the camp. The room inside was dimly lit, its walls bare except for a single American flag hanging above the desk. Sitting at the desk was an officer in a crisp U.S. uniform. But what stunned the prisoner wasn't the officer's appearance. It was his voice. "Setzen Sie sich, bitte. Please sit down." The German froze. The words were flawless, not clumsy or broken, but precise, like something his schoolteacher back home might have said. The officer continued, still in German. "Name, rank, unit." The young soldier muttered the basics, trying to keep his composure. He told himself this was just a trick. But the officer smiled faintly, as if reading his thoughts. "Ah, Panzer Grenadier. So you were with the 15th Panzer Division, weren't you? North Africa, perhaps? Kasserine Pass?" The soldier's heart pounded. How did this man know? His division had been scattered weeks ago. He had barely escaped before capture. And yet, here sat an American who spoke his language like a native and seemed to know more about his unit than he did. The interrogation continued, weaving between questions and casual remarks. The officer asked about rations, about equipment, about morale. Some questions were harmless. Others cut deep, like scalpels aimed not at the body but at the mind. And all of it, was in perfect German. What unnerved the prisoner most was the tone. This wasn't shouting, beating, or threatening. The officer's calm, conversational style chipped away at his defenses more effectively than any fist could. He realized with dread that this was psychological warfare at its finest. When the young soldier was finally dismissed, he stumbled out into the daylight, trembling. His comrades rushed to him, but he could barely speak. Only one sentence left his lips. "They know everything." As days turned into weeks, interrogation became a dreaded ritual. Some POWs tried to resist, clinging to silence. But the Americans' mastery of German made resistance nearly impossible. They understood slang, dialects, even coded jokes whispered between men. No matter how clever the prisoners thought they were, the Americans were always one step ahead. The psychological toll grew heavier with each passing day. In whispered conversations at night, POWs admitted their fear. "If even the guards speak our language," one muttered, "then what chance do we have against the entire country?" The camp no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a mirror, reflecting back their own culture, their own tongue, their own secrets. Only this time, under foreign control. And deep inside, a terrifying realization began to spread: America wasn't the crude, uneducated giant Nazi propaganda had painted. It was something far more dangerous, an enemy that listened, understood, and outsmarted them at every turn. Life in the camp settled into a rhythm: roll calls at dawn, work details, meals in the mess hall, and long, restless nights behind barbed wire. But for the German prisoners, routine was never comforting. It was a stage, and they were actors trapped in a play where every line they spoke was overheard. At first, some POWs tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy. They joked with each other in German, traded stories of home, and even whispered about the possibility of escape. Language, they thought, was their shield, the one thing the Americans could never fully breach. But day after day, that illusion was shattered. In the mess hall, a group of prisoners once complained about the watery soup, mocking the guards as they laughed in their native tongue. Moments later, an American sergeant strode past their table and, without missing a beat, replied in perfect German, "If you don't like it, perhaps you'd prefer the rations back in Stalingrad?" The room fell silent. The prisoners stared at their trays, cheeks burning with humiliation. Their laughter had turned against them. On another occasion, a pair of young soldiers whispered late into the night about a possible tunnel beneath the barracks. They used slang and half-sentences, thinking it was safe. The next morning, when they lined up for roll call, the guard on duty smirked and said casually in German, "Careful with your digging. The ground here is rocky." No punishment followed. No alarms, no solitary confinement. Just a quiet reminder: we hear you, we understand you, we own your secrets. That was far more terrifying than any barbed wire. Even harmless conversations lost their privacy. Men discussing letters from home, fears about the war, or simple memories of food and family suddenly found themselves echoed by American voices. Guards who seemed like faceless sentries now appeared as shadows in their minds, shadows who spoke their mother tongue. The effect was suffocating. It was as if the very walls of the camp had ears, and those ears spoke German. The prisoners began censoring themselves. They no longer joked freely. Conversations grew short, whispers shorter still. Many avoided speaking at all unless absolutely necessary. Silence became the only safe language left to them. But that silence carried its own torment. Without words, morale withered. Men who once held their heads high now walked with slumped shoulders. The sharp pride of German discipline eroded, not under whips or bullets, but under the invisible weight of understanding. What the POWs did not realize was how deliberate this strategy was. For the Americans, language wasn't just a tool of communication, it was a weapon. By turning German against its own speakers, they broke resistance without violence. It was a war of the mind, waged not on battlefields, but in the quiet corners of prison camps. And the Germans, once so confident in their superiority, now faced an enemy they could neither mock nor outwit. The barbed wire that surrounded them was no longer their greatest prison. Their own language had become the trap. By now, the prisoners understood one terrifying truth: nothing they said was private. But what they didn't know was how deeply the Americans had perfected the art of listening. The camp wasn't just a prison, it was a carefully designed intelligence machine. Hidden in the rafters of barracks, in the mess hall, even in the latrines, microphones picked up every word the prisoners spoke. The Germans thought they were clever, whispering in hushed tones or using coded phrases. What they didn't realize was that these conversations were being recorded, transcribed, and analyzed by teams of linguists, many of whom were German Americans themselves. Every laugh, every insult, every idle remark was sifted for information. And the results were staggering. Prisoners who thought they were complaining harmlessly about food sometimes revealed their unit designations. A casual grumble about a commander could expose where entire divisions were stationed. Even the way men cursed, using regional slang or dialect, helped the Americans pinpoint where they had grown up, which in turn revealed which units they likely belonged to. The intelligence value of language was immense. One night, 2 Luftwaffe pilots whispered about new aircraft models they had flown before capture. They spoke with excitement, believing no American could possibly understand the technical jargon they used. What they didn't know was that in a nearby room, a hidden microphone was transmitting every word to intelligence officers who understood it perfectly. By morning, Washington had fresh details on Germany's experimental aircraft. Another time, infantry soldiers bragged in their bunks about how their unit had ambushed an American patrol weeks earlier. They mentioned terrain, timing, and casualties, thinking it was nothing more than boasting among comrades. Within hours, U.S. intelligence had mapped out exactly which unit was operating in that region and how they moved. The Germans had no idea that their own pride and carelessness were feeding the enemy's war machine. What made it even worse was the way Americans used this information. Interrogators sometimes revealed knowledge that seemed impossible. A guard would casually mention a town a prisoner once lived in, or the precise weapon his unit had carried. To the Germans, it felt like the Americans had spies everywhere. In reality, the spies were the prisoners themselves, speaking too freely in a language the enemy had mastered. The humiliation deepened. Soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler now realized that even in captivity, they were still contributing to the Allied cause, unwittingly helping the very enemy they had fought to destroy. But perhaps the cruelest twist of all was this: the Americans didn't have to use threats or violence to extract information. They only had to listen. The Germans began to realize they were not warriors in a prison camp. They were chess pieces in a vast intelligence game. Every move, every word, every careless whisper was being played against them. And in this game, they were always 3 steps behind. It was not the battlefield that broke them. It was the silence that followed when they realized the war had already entered their barracks, their bunks, their very language. At first, the German prisoners tried to shrug it off. So the Americans speak a little German, they told themselves. So they know some of our habits. What of it? We are still soldiers of the Reich. We are still men of discipline. But slowly, day by day, that armor began to crack. The realization that they were always being understood gnawed at them. Conversations no longer felt private. Jokes died on their lips. Even the comfort of whispering to a comrade under the blankets at night carried the fear of unseen ears. Silence began to settle over the barracks, heavy and unnatural. And then came the doubt. If the Americans knew this much, what else did they know? Did they already have maps of their fortifications? Did they already know the weaknesses of German tanks? Did they know about secret weapons the Reich promised would turn the tide of the war? The prisoners began to suspect one another. Who told them? Whispered a soldier, glaring at his bunkmate. Was it you? Snapped another. Distrust spread like wildfire. Men who had fought shoulder to shoulder in North Africa or Normandy now eyed each other with suspicion. The camaraderie of the Wehrmacht began to fracture inside the camp's wooden walls. The Americans didn't have to lift a finger. The Germans were dismantling themselves. Then came the humiliation of hearing their captors speak German better than some of them did. Guards corrected their grammar. Interrogators quoted Goethe and Schiller. Some American-born linguists even used regional dialects so perfect that prisoners were stunned. These weren't just people who had learned German. These were people who lived it. For a German soldier raised on the idea of cultural superiority, nothing could have been more devastating. The pride of the Reich, the belief that German intellect and order stood above all, was crushed every time a farm boy from Wisconsin or a dockworker from New York spoke flawless German. Some of these Americans had never even set foot in Europe, yet they could match, even surpass, the language of Goethe and Nietzsche. It was as if the war followed them into captivity. They had lost on the battlefield, but here in the camps, they were losing their identity. The strain began to show in their behavior. Some prisoners withdrew completely, refusing to speak at all. Others lashed out in sudden fits of anger. smashing bowls in the mess hall or shouting at guards. A few even begged to be isolated from their own comrades, convinced that betrayal lurked in every bunk. What was once a strong, disciplined fighting force was reduced to a collection of broken men, haunted not by whips or chains, but by words, by the simple, devastating reality that the enemy could understand everything. For the first time, many of these soldiers realized, perhaps Germany was not the land of destiny they had been taught to believe. Perhaps the Reich was not invincible. Perhaps the enemy they mocked as soft and weak was stronger in ways they had never imagined. The collapse wasn't loud. It didn't come with riots or open rebellion. It came in quiet sighs, in sleepless nights, in the heavy silence of men who no longer trusted their own voices. And that silence was more powerful than any bullet, more devastating than any bomb. The prisoners had entered the camp as soldiers of Hitler. They were leaving, piece by piece, as men who no longer believed. War, the German prisoners soon realized, did not end when they were captured. It simply shifted battlefields. No longer was it fought with tanks, rifles, and artillery. Now, it was a war of the mind. And the Americans were winning. The guards didn't need to raise their voices. They didn't need to beat prisoners into submission. Instead, they used understanding as their weapon. A simple phrase spoken in perfect German could strip away a man's pride more effectively than any punishment. Picture it, a cocky German sergeant boasting in his native tongue to fellow POWs about the inept Americans. He thought it safe. He thought no one understood. And then, an American guard leaned in with a smirk and answered back, in flawless German. The entire barrack would erupt in laughter, half mocking, half nervous. The sergeant's face flushed red, not from pain but from humiliation. The message was clear: nothing you say is safe. Nothing you hide is secret. We know who you are, we know what you're thinking, and we will use it against you. This psychological dominance was deliberate. The US Army understood that men stripped of their pride were men easier to control. The fluent German wasn't just about communication, it was about power. But beyond humiliation, there was something more dangerous at work: influence. In every conversation, in every carefully placed comment, the Americans were planting seeds. A guard might casually mention how well-fed the prisoners were compared to German civilians back home. An interrogator might let slip how German cities were burning under Allied bombing. Sometimes, an offhand remark about how many Germans had already surrendered was enough to make a soldier's shoulders sag. And because it was said in their own language, clearly, confidently, without error, it carried more weight. It felt less like enemy propaganda and more like undeniable truth. One German officer later recalled in his memoirs, "It was not the rifles that defeated us in captivity. It was their words. Their words in our own tongue. They knew everything, and they spoke it as if they were one of us. We had no walls left to defend ourselves." For the Americans, this was the essence of warfare. Why waste resources breaking a man's body when you could shatter his spirit instead? And once the spirit broke, loyalty followed. Some prisoners even began to cooperate willingly. They shared information. They translated for their fellow Germans. A few even volunteered to broadcast messages urging other soldiers to surrender. The Germans had entered the camps with discipline, pride, and a belief in the Reich's superiority. By the time weeks turned into months, many of those same men were questioning everything. It was warfare stripped to its rawest form. No steel. No fire. No blood. Just words. But those words, spoken fluently, spoken with confidence, cut deeper than any weapon. For the first time, German soldiers were forced to admit something they had never dared to believe. In the realm of intelligence, psychology, and human understanding, the Americans were not behind. They were ahead. And it terrified them. Because if America could defeat them not only on the battlefield but also in their minds, what chance did Germany truly have? The Reich had invested in tanks, in planes, in rockets. But the Americans had invested in people, in language, in intelligence, in the art of breaking men without firing a single shot. It was a war fought without guns. And the Germans were losing it badly. For generations, the German military had been taught that discipline and pride were unshakable pillars of the soldier's identity. To be German was to be orderly. To be German was to be superior. But captivity in America was slowly dismantling those very beliefs, piece by piece, word by word. At first, many prisoners clung to their pride. Officers barked orders even inside the barbed wire fences. They marched their men in step during roll call, as though they were still on the parade grounds of Berlin. They sang Wehrmacht songs to remind themselves of who they were. But the facade didn't last. Why? Because every day they were confronted with something they could not reconcile. The Americans not only understood them, but they understood them better than their own officers. Imagine the sting of humiliation when a guard corrected a German officer's grammar in his own tongue. Imagine the shock when a simple American private recited Goethe or Schiller to prove his fluency. For men raised in the myth of German cultural supremacy, it was devastating. And then there was the food. While civilians back in Germany were starving, POWs in American camps were fed well, sometimes better than US soldiers themselves. Meat, bread, butter, coffee, luxuries their families hadn't seen in years. For the first time, German soldiers were forced to admit something they had never dared to believe. In the realm of intelligence, psychology, and human understanding, the Americans were not behind. They were ahead. And it terrified them. Because if America could defeat them not only on the battlefield but also in their minds, what chance did Germany truly have? The Reich had invested in tanks, in planes, in rockets. But the Americans had invested in people, in language, in intelligence, in the art of breaking men without firing a single shot. It was a war fought without guns. And the Germans were losing it badly. For generations, the German military had been taught that discipline and pride were unshakable pillars of the soldier's identity. To be German was to be orderly. To be German was to be superior. But captivity in America was slowly dismantling those very beliefs, piece by piece, word by word. At first, many prisoners clung to their pride. Officers barked orders even inside the barbed wire fences. They marched their men in step during roll call, as though they were still on the parade grounds of Berlin. They sang Wehrmacht songs to remind themselves of who they were. But the facade didn't last. Why? Because every day they were confronted with something they could not reconcile. The Americans not only understood them, but they understood them better than their own officers. Imagine the sting of humiliation when a guard corrected a German officer's grammar in his own tongue. Imagine the shock when a simple American private recited Goethe or Schiller to prove his fluency. For men raised in the myth of German cultural supremacy, it was devastating. And then there was the food. While civilians back in Germany were starving, POWs in American camps were fed well, sometimes better than US soldiers themselves. Meat, bread, butter, coffee, luxuries their families hadn't seen in years. Wars are often remembered for the roar of tanks, the thunder of artillery, the clash of armies. But sometimes, the most decisive victories happen in silence, in the words spoken across the table, in the conversations overheard behind barbed wire, in the quiet humiliation of realizing the enemy knows your language better than you do. For the German prisoners of war held in the United States, the battlefield had ended, but the fight for their minds had just begun. Every fluent word of German spoken by an American guard chipped away at the myths of superiority that the Nazi regime had built. They had been told that Americans were weak. They discovered Americans were not only strong, but resourceful, educated, and, most unsettling, familiar with Germany's own culture. They had been told that the Reich was destined to rule the world. They discovered that even as they sat eating full meals in POW camps, their homeland was collapsing into rubble. And they had been told that they, as soldiers of the Wehrmacht, were unbreakable. But they discovered that the real battlefield, the battlefield of the mind, was one they could not win. The American use of German-speaking guards, interrogators, and intelligence officers wasn't just clever, it was revolutionary. It turned captivity into a psychological weapon. It ensured that every careless word a prisoner spoke, every complaint, every whisper, could be understood, catalogued, and used. And more importantly, it showed the prisoners that there was no escape. No secret language. No cultural shield. Nothing left to hide behind. By the war's end, over 370,000 German POWs had passed through camps in the United States. Many went home humbled, their faith in the Reich shattered not only by the bombs that destroyed their cities, but by the words spoken by American guards in flawless German. For them, defeat was not just on the battlefield. It was in every conversation they thought was private. And that was the silent victory of the United States. Not one with bullets. Not one with tanks. But one with words, patience, and the quiet power of understanding your enemy better than he understands himself. When history is written, the spotlight often shines on the famous battles: Normandy, Stalingrad, the Bulge. Yet in the shadows of barbed wire, far from the front lines, another battle was fought and won. A battle where no shot was fired, and yet thousands of proud soldiers walked away defeated. The lesson endures even today. In war, technology and firepower matter, but the greatest victories often come from knowledge, language, and the ability to reach into the mind of your enemy. For the German POWs in America, the shock never truly faded. They came believing themselves superior. They left knowing the truth, that words can be sharper than swords, and silence, when it hides understanding, can be the deadliest weapon of all.